It's too late, she whispered, her voice barely louder than the soft hum of fluorescent lights above her, as the pen hovered over the signature line and trembled in her hand, the paper beneath it already creased from how tightly she had been holding it, as if crumpling it hard enough might somehow erase the choice it demanded. The hospital room smelled faintly of antiseptic and something colder, something emptier, and across from her, the billing coordinator waited with practiced patience. Eyes kind but distant, the kind of look people give when they've seen this moment too many times to feel it anymore. Emily Carter swallowed, her throat dry, her fingers aching from exhaustion as she glanced down at the number printed in bold, $18, $742.63, an amount that might as well have been $1 million, because to her, it was unreachable, impossible. A wall she had been slamming into for the past 12 hours without rest. Behind her, the steady beeping of a monitor echoed through the partially open door, each sound a reminder of what was at stake, each second ticking forward without waiting for her decision, and somewhere deeper in the hall, a baby cried, sharp and sudden, cutting through the silence like a reminder of every responsibility she carried alone. Emily closed her eyes for a brief second, and in that darkness, memories flickered. 5 years ago, a different room, warmer light, laughter that felt easy. A man's voice promising things that had once sounded permanent. Alexander Hayes had stood in front of her then, confident, certain, his world polished and limitless, while hers had just begun to crack beneath unexpected news, words she had struggled to say, words he hadn't been ready to hear. She remembered the pause, the hesitation in his eyes, the moment ambition outweighed everything else, and the quiet way he had stepped back, not cruel, not angry, just distant. As if choosing something else without ever saying it out loud. The memory faded as quickly as it came. Replaced by the present, the cold chair, the stack of forms, the weight of a reality that had no room for regret. Emily opened her eyes again, her gaze drifting to the small plastic bracelet still wrapped around her wrist, the ink slightly smudged from hours of wear, and she tightened her grip on the pen, forcing her hand to steady. She had worked double shifts, skipped meals, counted every dollar, stretched every paycheck until it snapped. But some things couldn't be outrun, no matter how hard she tried. Outside the room, footsteps moved quickly, voices overlapped in low murmurs. The world continuing at full speed while hers narrowed into this single moment. "Ma'am," the coordinator said gently, breaking the silence. "I know this is difficult, but we do need a decision so we can proceed accordingly." And Emily nodded, even though the motion felt distant, like her body was responding on its own. She lowered the pen slightly, her breath catching as her chest tightened, and for a fleeting second, her mind reached for something, someone, before she could stop it. A name surfaced uninvited, familiar and dangerous, and her fingers hesitated just long enough for doubt to slip in, thin and sharp. She had erased that number years ago, told herself she didn't need it, didn't want it, had convinced herself that whatever existed back then had already ended. But even now, standing at the edge of a decision she couldn't undo, the memory lingered, persistent, like a door she had never fully closed. Emily exhaled slowly, shaking her head as if to push the thought away. Because reaching back meant reopening something she had fought so hard to leave behind, and she couldn't afford that, not now. Not when everything depended on her staying strong. The pen touched the paper again, her hand steadier this time, her jaw tightening with quiet resolve as she leaned forward just enough to begin writing her name, each letter deliberate, final, as if carving the choice into something permanent. "It's too late," she repeated, softer now, more to herself than anyone else, and this time, there was no hesitation in her voice, only the quiet acceptance of someone who had already carried more than she should have had to bear, someone who had learned the hard way that sometimes, no matter how much you wish things could be different, the moment passes, and it doesn't come back. The pen left a faint scratch across the paper as Emily Carter finished the last letter of her name, the ink slightly uneven where her hand had trembled, and for a moment she did not move, her fingers still wrapped around the pen as if letting go would make everything that followed happen faster, more real. The coordinator gave a small, sympathetic nod and reached forward to collect the form, her movements efficient but gentle, like someone handling something fragile that could break if touched too roughly, and Emily pulled her hand back slowly, her palm cold and damp as she pressed it against her jeans, trying to steady the hollow feeling spreading through her chest. Somewhere down the hall, a door opened and closed, the faint squeak of rubber soles against polished floors echoing in a rhythm that felt too steady compared to the chaos inside her, and when the coordinator spoke again, her voice was softer now, almost apologetic. Explaining the next steps, outlining procedures in careful, neutral language that avoided emotion, as if emotion did not belong in decisions like this. Emily nodded without really hearing the words, her attention drifting instead to the small digital clock mounted on the wall, its red numbers blinking forward 1 second at a time, each tick a quiet reminder that time did not pause for doubt or regret, and she swallowed again, her throat tight as she stood up from the chair. Her legs slightly unsteady after hours of sitting, worry settling deep into her muscles. The hallway outside felt colder than the room, the air conditioning humming overhead as she stepped out, her eyes instinctively drawn toward the partially open door a few feet away, where the steady beeping continued, measured and calm, indifferent to everything else. She hesitated there, just for a second, her hand hovering near the doorframe before she gently pushed it open, careful not to make noise. As if quietness could somehow protect what was inside, the room beyond was dimmer, lit only by the soft glow of monitors and a small lamp near the bed, and Emily stepped in slowly, her breath catching as her gaze settled on the tiny figure resting beneath the thin hospital blanket, so small it made everything else in the room feel oversized, distant, unreal. She moved closer, each step deliberate, until she reached the bedside, her fingers curling lightly around the metal railing as she leaned in, her shoulders dropping just slightly, the tension in her posture easing in the presence of something that mattered more than anything else. "Hey," she whispered, her voice softer now, stripped of the strain it carried before, as if speaking here required a different kind of strength, and she brushed a loose strand of hair back from her face before reaching out, her fingertips hovering for a brief moment before gently touching the small hand resting near the blanket, the contact light, careful, as if she was afraid even the slightest pressure might be too much. The monitor continued its steady rhythm, a quiet reassurance in a space filled with uncertainty, and Emily exhaled slowly, her breath shaky but controlled, her eyes lingering there, memorizing every detail as if committing it to something deeper than memory. She had promised herself she would handle everything, that she would never depend on anyone else again, that she would not let the past define what came next, and yet standing here now, with the weight of her decision settling in, she felt the edges of that resolve begin to blur, not breaking, but bending under the quiet realization that some battles were never meant to be fought alone. Her gaze dropped briefly to her own hand still resting against the railing, the faint indent of the hospital bracelet visible against her skin, and she turned her wrist slightly, reading the printed name again as if grounding herself in something tangible, something real. Emily straightened after a moment, drawing in a deeper breath as she stepped back, her shoulders squaring with quiet determination, because no matter how impossible things felt, she had made a choice, and now she would have to live with it. Carry it forward the same way she carried everything else. One step at a time. As she turned toward the door, her phone buzzed faintly in her pocket, the sound so unexpected in the stillness that it made her pause, her brows knitting slightly as she reached for it. Her fingers hesitating for just a fraction of a second before she pulled it out, the screen lighting up in the dim room, casting a pale glow across her face. The number on the display was unfamiliar, no name attached, just a string of digits that meant nothing on its own, and yet something about it made her chest tighten, a quiet, inexplicable pull that she could not explain. Her thumb hovering over the screen as the vibration continued, insistent but not aggressive, like a question waiting for an answer. Emily stared at it, her mind flickering between instinct and caution, between the need to hold on to control and the strange feeling that maybe, just maybe, not everything was as finished as she believed, and for a moment, the room seemed to hold its breath with her, suspended between what had already been decided and what might still change. Emily's thumb hovered over the glowing screen for one breath longer before instinct pulled her hand back slightly, her chest tightening as the phone continued to vibrate softly against her palm, the unfamiliar number staring up at her like something unfinished, something that refused to stay buried. She glanced once more toward the small bed behind her, the steady rhythm of the monitor grounding her just enough to make a decision, and then, with a quiet exhale, she stepped out into the hallway. Before answering, as if distance might somehow protect the fragile space she had just left, the call connected with a faint click, and for a second there was nothing but silence on the line, the kind of silence that carried weight, as if the person on the other end was choosing their first words carefully, and Emily almost hung up, her fingers tightening around the phone. Her instincts urging her to retreat back into the certainty of what she had already decided. Then a voice came through, low and controlled, but unmistakably human in the way it carried hesitation beneath the surface, and the moment she heard it, something inside her shifted, subtle but undeniable. "Emily," he said, not questioning, not guessing, but certain, as if he had already confirmed what he needed to know before dialing, and the sound of her name in that voice felt too familiar, like a memory stepping into the present without permission. She froze where she stood, her breath catching as her eyes focused on nothing in particular, the sterile white walls around her blurring slightly as her mind struggled to catch up with what her ears had already recognized. 5 years had changed everything, but not that voice, not the quiet authority it carried. Not the way it seemed to reach her before she could put up the walls she had spent so long building. "You have the wrong number," she said quickly, her tone sharper than she intended, the words coming out more like a reflex than a choice, because denial was easier, safer, something she could control. There was a brief pause on the other end, not confusion, not doubt, just a measured silence, and then he spoke again, softer this time, but firmer, as if he understood exactly what she was trying to do and refused to let her do it. "No," Alexander Hayes replied, his voice steady now, grounded in a way that carried intention. "I do not think I do." And Emily closed her eyes for a second, pressing her free hand against her temple as if that might stop the past from flooding in. But it did not. Because memory does not ask permission when it returns. She could see him as clearly as if he were standing in front of her, the tailored suit, the calm expression, the way he always seemed to know exactly what to say even when everything else felt uncertain. And that certainty had once been the thing she trusted most, until it became the thing that broke her. "You should not be calling me," she said, her voice lower now, less defensive but no less firm, each word placed carefully as if building a boundary one sentence at a time, and for a moment she thought that might be enough, that he would accept it, that he would respect the distance she had fought so hard to create. But Alexander did not respond the way she expected, because instead of retreating, his voice shifted slightly, not louder, not more forceful, but more personal, more present, as if he had stepped closer without physically being there. "I know where you are," he said, and the words landed differently than anything else he had said so far, not as a threat, not as control, but as a statement that carried urgency beneath its calm surface, and Emily's eyes opened immediately, her gaze snapping toward the far end of the hallway as if she might see him standing there, even though she knew that was impossible. Her heart picked up just slightly, not in fear, but in something more complicated, something she did not want to name, and she shook her head instinctively, even though he could not see it. "Do not," she started, her voice faltering for just a fraction of a second before she steadied it again. "Do not come here." Because the idea of him stepping into this moment, into this fragile, carefully contained reality she had built, felt like something that could unravel everything. There was another pause, shorter this time, and when he spoke again, his tone had changed just enough to make her grip tighten around the phone, because it was no longer distant, no longer controlled in the same way, but threaded with something she had never heard from him before. "Emily," he said quietly, "it is already too late for that." And before she could respond, before she could argue or refuse or rebuild the distance she needed, the line went silent, the call ending with a soft click that echoed louder in her ears than it should have, leaving her standing alone in the hallway, her reflection faintly visible in the polished floor beneath her, as the reality of what he had just said settled in, not loudly, not dramatically, but with a quiet certainty that felt impossible to ignore. Emily stood frozen for a moment after the call ended, the phone still pressed against her ear even though the line had gone silent, her heartbeat no longer steady but uneven, as if trying to catch up with something her mind had not fully accepted yet. The fluorescent lights above flickered softly, casting a pale reflection across the polished floor, and she lowered the phone slowly, her fingers tightening around it as she replayed his words in her head, not loudly, not dramatically, but with a quiet certainty that unsettled her more than anything else he could have said. He knew where she was, and not in the vague way people sometimes guessed, but with a clarity that felt immediate, present, as if the distance between them had already been crossed before she even realized it. Emily shook her head slightly, forcing herself to move, to breathe, to do something other than stand there letting the past creep back into a space she had fought so hard to protect, and she turned quickly, her steps faster now as she walked back toward the room, her mind already building walls, rehearsing the words she would say if he actually showed up, because he would not, she told herself. People like Alexander Hayes did not just appear in places like this without reason, without control, and yet something in the tone of his voice told her this was different, that whatever had brought him here was not part of the carefully structured world he usually operated in. She reached the door and pushed it open, stepping inside with a quiet breath, as if crossing back into a space she could still manage, still understand, and her eyes went immediately to the small bed, to the steady rise and fall beneath the blanket, to the monitor that continued its calm rhythm without interruption, and for a second, everything felt almost normal again, almost contained. Emily moved closer, resting her hand lightly on the rail, her shoulders dropping just enough to release some of the tension that had built in her chest, and she focused on that rhythm, that quiet, predictable sound, letting it anchor her as the noise in her head slowly settled. She did not want him here. She did not need him here. She had built this life piece by piece without him, had learned how to carry every responsibility on her own, how to make decisions without looking for anyone else to share the weight, and she was not about to let that change now, not when it mattered most. Her jaw tightened slightly as she straightened, her resolve returning in small, steady layers. And she reached for the edge of the blanket, adjusting it gently, more out of habit than necessity, as if small actions could reinforce the control she needed to hold on to. Then, faintly at first, she heard it, the distant sound of footsteps approaching down the hallway, measured but purposeful, not rushed, not hesitant, just steady, and something about that rhythm made her pause, her hand stilling as her attention shifted toward the door. The hospital was never completely quiet, there were always sounds, always movement, but this felt different, not louder, not more urgent, just directed, as if someone was walking with intention rather than wandering through routine. Emily's breath slowed slightly as she listened, telling herself it was nothing, just another staff member. Another visitor, another moment passing like all the others, but the sound grew closer, more distinct, and her chest tightened again, not in panic, but in recognition of something she could not quite explain. She turned slowly, her gaze moving toward the door just as a shadow crossed the narrow gap beneath it, the light from the hallway shifting for a brief second before returning, and then there was a soft knock, controlled, deliberate. The kind of knock that did not ask loudly but expected to be heard. Emily did not answer right away, her fingers curling slightly against the rail as she stood there, her mind caught between instinct and reality, between the part of her that wanted to ignore it and the part that already knew she could not. The knock came again, just once, no louder than before, and this time she stepped forward, each movement careful, measured, as if approaching something that could change more than just the next few minutes. Her hand reached for the handle, hesitating for the briefest moment before she turned it and pulled the door open, the hallway light spilling into the dim room, outlining the figure standing there in sharp contrast, and for a second neither of them spoke, because some moments do not need words to make their impact known. Alexander Hayes stood exactly where she knew he would be, composed, steady, his presence filling the space without effort, his eyes finding hers immediately with a focus that felt both familiar and entirely new, as if he was seeing her clearly for the first time in years. Emily's breath caught, not because she was surprised to see him, but because part of her had hoped she would be, that something would prove this was not real, that this was not happening now, in this place, at this exact moment. But he was there, undeniably real, and the silence between them stretched just long enough to hold everything that had been left unsaid for years. Before he finally spoke, his voice quiet, controlled, but carrying something deeper beneath it that she could not ignore. "You did not answer the second time," he said, not as an accusation, not as a question, but as a simple acknowledgement, and Emily felt her grip tighten on the door, her response forming before she could stop it, sharp, defensive, built from everything she had learned to protect herself with. "I told you not to come," she replied, her voice steady but firm, and for a brief second, the corner of his expression shifted, not in anger, not in frustration, but in something quieter, something that looked almost like understanding, as if he had expected that answer before she even said it, and yet he did not step back, did not retreat, did not break eye contact. Instead, he held her gaze with a calm that felt unmovable, and when he spoke again, his voice was just as steady, but now it carried the weight of a decision already made, something that was not waiting for permission. "I know," he said softly, and then, after the smallest pause, "but I am not here because it is convenient." And the way he said it made something shift in the air between them, subtle but undeniable, as if the space itself had changed, no longer defined by distance, but by something that refused to stay in the past where it belonged. Emily did not move aside, her hand still gripping the edge of the door as if that thin barrier was the only thing keeping her world from shifting under her feet, and for a moment neither of them spoke, the silence stretching between them not empty but full of everything that had been left unfinished years ago. The hallway light framed Alexander in sharp lines, his tailored coat still holding the crispness of a world far removed from this place, from the quiet hum of machines and the faint scent of antiseptic that clung to everything here, and yet there was something different in the way he stood now, less distant, less untouchable, as if the space he had stepped into required something more human than the version of himself he had spent years perfecting. Emily's jaw tightened slightly as she held his gaze, refusing to let the familiarity weaken the resolve she had built, because she knew how easily that could happen, how quickly the past could blur into the present if she allowed even a small crack to form. "You should leave," she said finally, her voice steady but low, not raised, not emotional, just firm enough to draw a line that she needed him to see clearly, and for a second, she thought he might argue, might step forward, might try to push past her the way people with power often did when they were not used to being told no. But Alexander did none of that. Instead, he remained exactly where he was, his expression calm, his eyes not leaving hers as if he was measuring something deeper than her words, something she was not saying out loud. "I am not here to make this harder for you," he replied, his tone even, controlled, but there was something beneath it, something quieter, almost careful, as if he understood that one wrong word could close the door she was holding on to. Emily let out a short breath that was not quite a laugh, more disbelief than anything else, and she shook her head slightly, her grip on the door tightening for a fraction of a second before she forced herself to relax it. "You already did that 5 years ago," she said, the words slipping out sharper than she intended, carrying more weight than she had planned to reveal, and for the first time since he arrived, something in Alexander's expression shifted, not dramatically, not visibly enough for anyone else to notice, but enough for her to see it, a brief flicker of something that looked like recognition, like acknowledgement of a truth he could not deny. The silence that followed felt different, heavier, but not hostile. More like something settling into place after being ignored for too long. And Emily swallowed, her throat tightening slightly as she glanced past him down the hallway, as if looking for an escape that was not there. "Whatever you came here for," she continued, her voice quieter now but no less firm, "you should go back to your life, Alexander, because nothing you do here is going to change anything." And as soon as she said it, she felt the truth of it settle in, not as certainty, but as something she needed to believe to keep herself standing where she was. Alexander did not respond right away, his gaze steady, his posture unchanged, and for a moment it almost felt like he was giving her the space to say everything she needed to say before he answered, as if he was no longer trying to control the moment but understand it. Then, slowly, he shifted his attention past her, his eyes moving toward the dimly lit room behind her, and Emily instinctively stepped slightly to the side, not enough to invite him in, but enough that the small space inside became visible, the soft glow of the monitor, the quiet stillness that filled the room. Alexander's expression did not change immediately. But something in the way his shoulders settled, the way his focus sharpened, made it clear that what he saw mattered, not in the detached way of observation, but in a way that reached deeper than that. "You said nothing can change," he said after a moment, his voice lower now, more grounded, and Emily felt a small tension rise in her chest at the calm certainty in his tone, because it was the same tone he used when he was absolutely sure of something, the same tone that had once made her trust him without question. She held her ground, her chin lifting slightly as she met his gaze again, ready to push back, ready to end this before it went any further, but the words she had prepared did not come out the way she expected when he spoke again. "Then why does it feel like everything already has?" he said quietly, not as a challenge, not as a contradiction, but as a simple statement that carried more weight than anything louder could have, and Emily felt her breath catch, just for a second, because somewhere beneath the anger, beneath the walls, beneath everything she had built to survive, there was a part of her that recognized what he meant, even if she was not ready to admit it, even if she refused to let it change what she had already decided. Emily felt the words settle between them like something fragile that neither of them could take back, and for a moment she did not respond, her fingers loosening slightly on the door as her mind tried to push away the quiet truth hidden inside what he had said, because acknowledging it meant admitting that something had already shifted, and she could not afford that. Not now. She straightened instinctively, her shoulders pulling back as if posture alone could restore the distance she needed, and she stepped forward just enough to narrow the space between them again, not inviting him in, but not retreating either. "You are looking at a situation you do not understand," she said, her voice measured, controlled, each word placed carefully as if precision could protect her from losing ground, and she held his gaze with quiet determination, refusing to let him see anything beyond what she chose to show. Alexander listened without interrupting, his expression unchanged, but there was a stillness in the way he stood that felt deliberate, as if he was absorbing more than just her words, as if he was reading everything she was trying not to say. "Then help me understand," he replied after a moment, his tone calm, not demanding, not forceful, just steady in a way that made it harder to dismiss, and Emily let out a small breath through her nose, the kind that carried both frustration and disbelief, because of course he would say that, of course he would approach this like something that could be solved with logic, with clarity, with enough information. She shook her head slightly, her eyes dropping for a fraction of a second before returning to his, sharper now, more guarded. "This is not something you fix with understanding," she said, her voice tightening just enough to reveal the strain beneath it. "This is something you live with." And the difference between those two things hung in the air, quiet but unmistakable. For the first time since he arrived, Alexander shifted his weight slightly, not stepping forward, not crossing the boundary she had set, but grounding himself in a way that felt more present, less removed, and when he spoke again, there was a subtle change in his voice. Not louder, not more emotional, but more honest, less filtered through the control he was known for. "I know I cannot change what happened," he said, and Emily felt a flicker of surprise at the admission, small but real, because it was not something she had expected him to say, not like that, not without defense or explanation, and she watched him closely now, searching for the angle, the strategy, the reason behind his words, but what she saw instead unsettled her more than anything calculated ever could. "But I can decide what I do now," he continued, and there was a quiet certainty in the statement that did not ask for agreement, did not require validation, it simply existed, solid and unwavering. Emily's grip on the door eased without her noticing, her focus narrowing on him as if the rest of the hallway had faded away, and she felt the familiar pull of his presence, not as it had been before, not as something easy or comforting, but as something complicated, something she could not ignore even if she wanted to. "And what exactly do you think you can do now?" she asked, her voice softer but edged with skepticism, because she needed to hear it, needed to understand what he believed he could bring into a situation that had already pushed her to the edge of what she could handle. Alexander did not answer immediately, his gaze shifting past her once more, drawn toward the quiet room behind her, and this time Emily did not move to block the view, her attention fixed on him. As she watched, something change in his expression, not dramatically, not in a way that could be easily defined, but enough to make her chest tighten slightly. "I can make sure you are not alone in this," he said finally, his voice low, steady, carrying a weight that felt different from anything he had said before, and Emily felt the words hit somewhere deeper than she expected, not because they were new, but because of the way he said them, without condition, without expectation, just a simple statement of intent. She let out a small, disbelieving breath, shaking her head again, because it would be easier to reject that, easier to dismiss it as too late, too irrelevant, too disconnected from the reality she had been living, but the truth was more complicated than that, and she knew it. "You do not get to decide that," she replied, her voice quieter now, less sharp but no less firm, and for a moment, the tension between them shifted, not breaking, not resolving, but changing shape into something that felt less like opposition and more like a question neither of them had fully answered yet. Alexander met her gaze without hesitation, and when he spoke again, his words were simple, but they carried a clarity that left little room for misunderstanding. "Maybe not," he said, "but I am still here." And the weight of that presence, quiet and unyielding, settled into the space between them, not forcing anything, not demanding anything, just existing in a way that made it impossible to ignore, no matter how much she wanted to. Emily held his gaze for a moment longer, searching for hesitation, for doubt, for anything that would make his words easier to dismiss, but what she found instead unsettled her more, because there was none, only a quiet steadiness that refused to shift under pressure, and she felt something tighten in her chest again, not fear, not anger, but something far more complicated, something she had spent years learning how to ignore. She turned away first, breaking the moment before it could pull her any deeper, her hand moving back to the door as she stepped aside just enough to slip into the room without inviting him in, the unspoken boundary still there, still firm, even as the distance between them had already begun to change. "You can stand out there all night if you want," she said over her shoulder, her voice quieter now, less sharp, more tired than anything else. "But it will not change anything." And with that, she moved fully inside, leaving the door partially open behind her, not wide enough to welcome, not closed enough to shut him out completely. The room felt smaller now, more aware, as if his presence in the hallway had shifted the air itself, and Emily exhaled slowly as she walked back to the bedside, her fingers brushing lightly against the rail again, grounding herself in something real, something she could control. The steady beep of the monitor continued, unchanged, unaffected by anything happening outside the door, and she focused on that rhythm, letting it pull her attention away from the tension lingering just beyond the threshold. She did not hear him step in at first, but she felt it, the subtle shift in space, the quiet presence that did not announce itself loudly but made itself known anyway, and when she glanced toward the door again, Alexander was no longer standing in the hallway, he was inside. Just a few steps past the threshold, his movements careful, deliberate, as if he understood that even crossing that small distance required permission he had not been given. Emily's posture stiffened slightly, her eyes narrowing just enough to show she had noticed, and for a second, the old instinct rose again, to push him back out, to reclaim the space entirely, but the words did not come, not immediately. Because something else interrupted them. Alexander's gaze had settled on the small figure in the bed, his focus no longer on her, no longer on the tension between them, but on something far quieter, far more important, and the shift was so subtle, so natural, that Emily found herself watching him instead of speaking, trying to understand what she was seeing. He did not move closer right away, did not step forward or reach out, he simply stood there, his shoulders slightly lowered. His expression no longer controlled in the same way, as if the room had stripped away the distance he usually kept between himself and everything else. "How long has she been here?" he asked after a moment, his voice low, careful, and Emily blinked slightly at the question, not because of the words themselves, but because of how he asked them, without assumption, without authority, just a simple request for truth. "Since this morning," she replied after a brief pause, her tone guarded but quieter now, her attention still fixed on him as she measured every reaction, every subtle change. Alexander nodded once, his gaze not leaving the bed, and Emily felt something shift again, smaller this time, but still there, like the first crack in something that had been sealed for too long. And the doctors? He continued, his voice steady. What are they saying? And Emily let out a slow breath, her fingers tightening slightly against the rail as the weight of that question settled in, because answering it meant saying things out loud that she had barely allowed herself to think. They are saying what they always say when you do not have enough, she replied, her voice flat now, stripped of anything but the truth, and she looked away for a second, her gaze dropping to the floor before returning to him, sharper this time, more defensive, because this was where the line had to be drawn. Which is why this is not your problem, she added more firmly, her chin lifting slightly as if reinforcing the boundaries she refused to let him cross. Alexander did not react the way she expected, did not argue, did not dismiss her words. Instead, he finally stepped forward, slowly, carefully, closing the distance to the bedside with a restraint that felt intentional, and he stopped just short of the rail, his presence close now, but not intrusive. He looked down for a moment, his expression unreadable, and when he spoke again, his voice was quieter than before, almost reflective, as if he was choosing each word with more care than usual. You are wrong about one thing, he said, and Emily felt her breath catch slightly at the shift in his tone, because it was not confrontational, not dismissive, just certain in a way that made it harder to push away. She watched him closely, waiting for the explanation, the justification, the reason he believed he could insert himself into something she had already decided alone, and when he finally lifted his gaze to meet hers again, there was something different in his eyes, something that had not been there before, something that made her chest tighten in a way she could not easily explain. This became my problem the moment I realized what I had missed, he said quietly, and the words did not land loudly, did not demand attention, but they carried a weight that settled deeply, because they were not about control, not about power, they were about something else entirely, something that had nothing to do with the life he had built, and everything to do with the one he had left behind. And for the first time since he walked into that hallway, Emily did not have an immediate answer, because part of her understood exactly what he meant, even if she was not ready to accept it. Emily felt the words linger in the air long after he said them, not loud, not forceful, but heavy in a way that made it difficult to move past them, and for a moment she did not speak, her fingers tightening slightly on the rail as she looked down at the small bed instead of at him, because it was easier to focus on something that needed her than to face what he had just admitted. The steady rhythm of the monitor continued, calm and unchanging, a quiet contrast to the tension building inside her, and she swallowed slowly, forcing herself to breathe evenly as she tried to gather the thoughts that had begun to scatter the moment he stepped into her world again. You do not get to decide what you missed, she said finally, her voice low, controlled, but there was a crack in it now, something subtle that had not been there before, and she kept her gaze fixed downward, not ready to meet his eyes yet, because she knew what she might see there, and she was not sure she was strong enough to push it away this time. Alexander did not respond immediately, and that silence felt intentional, not empty, as if he was allowing her words to exist without trying to correct them, and when she did look up again, just briefly, she saw that he had not moved, that he was still standing exactly where he had been, close enough to matter but not close enough to invade the space she was holding onto. Then tell me what I missed, he said quietly, and there was no defensiveness in his tone, no attempt to justify himself, only a simple request that felt more like an opening than a challenge, and Emily let out a small breath, almost a laugh but without humor, her head shaking slightly as if the answer to that question was far too large to fit into words. Everything, she replied, and this time she did meet his gaze, her eyes steady but no longer sharp, just tired, carrying the weight of years she had carried alone. You missed everything. And the simplicity of it made it harder to dismiss, because there was nothing exaggerated in it, nothing dramatic, just the truth as she had lived it. Alexander's expression shifted again, not visibly to anyone else, but enough for her to see it, enough to know that her words had landed exactly where they needed to, and for a moment he looked away. His gaze dropping to the floor as if absorbing something he could not immediately respond to, something that required more than the control he was used to maintaining. Emily watched him carefully, expecting the distance to return, expecting him to retreat back into the version of himself that did not allow things to reach him like this. But when he looked back up, that distance was still missing, replaced by something quieter, something more present. "Then I am here now," he said, and the words were simple, almost understated, but they carried a weight that made her chest tighten again, because they were not about the past, not about fixing what had already been lost, but about something current, something immediate, something she did not know how to handle. She turned away again, her hand moving instinctively to adjust the blanket even though it did not need adjusting, her movements small, controlled, a way to keep herself grounded when everything else felt uncertain, and for a few seconds neither of them spoke. The room settling into a quiet that felt different from before, less tense but not resolved. "Being here does not change what happens next," she said after a moment, her voice softer now, less defensive but still firm, and she glanced toward the door briefly, as if reminding herself that she still had the option to end this, to send him away and return to the certainty she had built without him. Alexander followed her gaze for a fraction of a second before returning his attention to her, and when he spoke again, his tone was just as steady as before, but there was something more in it now, something that felt less like a statement and more like a promise. "Maybe not," he said, "but it changes how you go through it." And Emily felt that land somewhere deeper than she expected, not because she agreed, but because part of her understood exactly what he meant, even if she was not ready to accept it. She shook her head slightly, her breath uneven for just a second before she steadied it again, and she turned back toward him fully this time, her posture straightening as she met his gaze with quiet resolve. "I have been going through it just fine," she said, and there was truth in that, even if it was incomplete, even if it did not account for the exhaustion, the doubt, the moments she had carried alone when no one else saw. Alexander did not argue, did not challenge her claim, and that absence of resistance made it harder to hold on to her certainty, because there was nothing to push against, nothing to reject, only his presence, steady and unyielding in a way that did not force her but did not leave either. He took a small breath, almost imperceptible. And then his gaze shifted once more to the small bed between them, his focus softening in a way that felt different from anything she had seen before, and when he spoke again, his voice was quieter, more grounded, as if the room itself had changed how he carried his words. "What is her name?" he asked, and the question was simple, but it carried something deeper beneath it, something that made Emily pause, her answer forming slowly as she realized that this was not just curiosity, not just information, it was something more, something that acknowledged a connection she had tried to keep separate for as long as she could. She hesitated for a second, her eyes flickering toward the small bed before returning to him, and then, quietly, she answered, "Lily." And the name seemed to settle into the space between them, soft but significant, as if it marked the beginning of something neither of them had fully prepared for, something that could not be undone now that it had been spoken aloud. "Lily," he repeated quietly, not as a question, but as if committing it to memory, and something in the way he said her name made Emily's chest tighten unexpectedly, because it was not casual, not distant, it was careful, deliberate, like it mattered more than it should to someone who had only just heard it. She watched him closely now, her guard still up, still present, but shifting in small ways she could not fully control, as if the moment had begun to move beyond the boundaries she had set. Alexander stepped a fraction closer to the bedside, not enough to crowd her, but enough that the soft glow of the monitor reflected faintly across his face, softening the edges of the composed expression he usually carried. And for the first time since he entered the room, he did not look like a man used to being in control of everything around him. He looked like someone trying to understand something he could not quantify. Emily noticed the change, subtle but undeniable, and it unsettled her more than anger would have, because anger she could push against. But this quiet attention, this careful presence, it did not give her anything to fight. "She is strong," Emily said after a moment, her voice softer now, almost instinctive, as if speaking about Lily required a different tone. One that did not carry the sharp edges she had been using with him, and her eyes dropped to the small bed again, her fingers brushing lightly along the edge of the blanket as she spoke. Stronger than she looks. And there was a faint hint of something else in her voice now, something deeper than determination, something closer to hope, even if she was not ready to name it that. Alexander nodded once, his gaze still fixed on Lily, and for a second the room felt suspended in a quiet that did not need words, the steady rhythm of the monitor filling the space where conversation might have been, grounding both of them in something real. Then his eyes shifted slightly, drawn to the small plastic bracelet around Lily's wrist, the printed information visible in the dim light, and Emily noticed the change immediately, her posture stiffening just a fraction, her breath catching in a way she could not hide fast enough. He did not reach for it, did not lean in too close, but he saw it, and she knew he saw it, the last name printed clearly beneath the first, the details she had never spoken aloud, never offered, never needed to explain because until now, there had been no one here who would recognize what it meant. The silence stretched for a second longer, heavier now, carrying something new, something that had not been there before, and when Alexander finally looked back at her, there was no confusion in his expression, no hesitation, just a quiet realization settling into place, piece by piece. Emily felt it before he said anything, the shift in understanding, the way the air itself seemed to change. And her fingers tightened slightly against the rail as she straightened, her instinct to protect rising again, stronger this time, sharper. "Do not," she said quickly, her voice firmer now, the softness from before gone, replaced by something more defensive, more urgent, and she held his gaze with a steadiness that did not waver, because this was the line she could not let him cross. "Do not make assumptions." And the words came out controlled, but there was tension beneath them, a clear warning wrapped in restraint. Alexander did not respond immediately, and that silence felt different now, not uncertain, not questioning, but deliberate, as if he was choosing his words with more care than before, understanding that this moment mattered in a way the others had not. "I am not assuming," he said finally, his voice low, steady, but there was something else in it now, something that carried weight beyond the words themselves. "I am recognizing." And Emily felt the impact of that more than she expected, not because of what he said, but because of how certain he sounded, how calm, as if he was not reaching for an answer, but acknowledging one that had already formed. She shook her head instinctively, her breath uneven for a fraction of a second before she steadied it again, because she could not let this become what he thought it was, not now, not like this, not when everything else was already at stake. "You do not get to do that," she replied, her voice quieter but firm, her eyes not leaving his. "You do not get to walk in here and decide what this means." And for a moment, the tension between them sharpened again, not loud, not explosive, but focused, like a line drawn clearly between two people who understood exactly where it stood. Alexander held her gaze, not challenging, not dismissing, just present, and when he spoke again, his voice did not rise, did not push, it remained steady, grounded in a way that made it harder to reject. "Then tell me I am wrong," he said simply, and the weight of that request settled between them immediately, because it was not a demand, not an accusation, it was an opening, a space for truth that he was willing to accept either way. Emily felt her breath catch again, just slightly, because for the first time since he had arrived, she realized that this was not something she could deflect easily, not something she could push away with a single answer, because whatever she said next would not just end the moment, it would define it, and as she stood there, her hands still resting on the rail, her eyes locked with his, she felt the past and the present collide in a way that left no simple path forward, only the quiet, undeniable realization that some truths do not stay hidden once they have been seen. Emily felt the weight of his words press into the silence, heavier than anything he had said before, because this time there was no distance left to hide behind, no misunderstanding to deflect, only a truth standing between them that demanded to be acknowledged, and for a moment she could not speak, her throat tightening as her gaze dropped to the small bed beside her, to the quiet rise and fall that had become the center of her world. The steady rhythm of the monitor filled the space again. Constant and grounding, and she focused on it, letting the sound anchor her as everything else threatened to shift beyond her control. "You do not need to know," she said finally, her voice low, controlled, but softer now, less guarded than before, and she kept her eyes on Lily, her fingers resting lightly against the rail as if drawing strength from the simple contact. Alexander did not respond immediately, and that silence carried a different kind of tension, not pressure, not urgency, but patience, as if he understood that pushing now would only break something that could not be repaired. Emily swallowed slowly, her breath uneven for just a second before she steadied it again, because she knew what he was asking, and she knew why it mattered, even if she had spent years convincing herself that it did not. "I handled it," she continued, her voice still quiet, still measured, but there was something else in it now, something deeper, something that carried the weight of every decision she had made alone. "I made the choices, I lived with them, and I did not need anyone else to do that for me." And as she spoke, she straightened slightly, her shoulders pulling back as if reclaiming the ground she had been losing since he walked into the room. Alexander listened, his expression unchanged, but there was a stillness in him now that felt different, less about control and more about understanding, as if he was allowing her to say everything she needed to say without interruption. "You did not give me that chance," he said after a moment, his voice steady, not accusing, not defensive, just honest in a way that caught her off guard, and Emily felt a flicker of something sharp in her chest, something that rose quickly before she could stop it. "You walked away," she replied, her eyes lifting to meet his again, her voice firmer now, carrying the truths she had held on to for years. "You made your choice first." And the words landed clearly, not raised, not emotional, but undeniable in their simplicity. Alexander held her gaze, and for the first time since he had arrived, there was no attempt to soften what she said, no explanation offered immediately, just a quiet acceptance. That settled between them, and when he finally spoke again, his tone had shifted slightly, not in volume, but in depth, as if he was no longer speaking from the distance of who he had been, but from where he stood now. "I did," he admitted, and the words were simple, unguarded, carrying none of the justification she had expected, and that alone made them harder to push away. "And I was wrong." And the quiet certainty in that statement made something in Emily falter, just for a second, because it was not what she had prepared for, not what she had built her defenses against. She looked at him carefully, searching for something beneath the admission, some sign that it was incomplete, that it came with conditions, but there was nothing there except the truth as he was choosing to present it now. "That does not change anything," she said after a moment, her voice softer again, less certain than before, and she glanced back at Lily, her hand moving instinctively to adjust the blanket, a small action that grounded her in the present when everything else felt uncertain. Alexander stepped slightly closer, not crossing into her space, but close enough that his presence felt more immediate, more real, and when he spoke again, his voice was quieter than before, but no less steady. "It changes what I do next," he said, and Emily felt the weight of that settle into the room, not as a promise made lightly, but as something already decided, something that did not depend on her agreement to exist. She let out a small breath, her eyes closing briefly before she opened them again, because she could feel the shift happening, subtle but undeniable, and she did not know how to stop it, did not know if she even could. "You cannot fix this," she said quietly, not as a challenge, not as a rejection, but as a truth she needed to hold on to, and Alexander nodded once, his gaze steady, his expression calm in a way that felt different from before. "I know," he replied, "but I am not trying to fix it." And there was a pause, brief but meaningful, before he added, his voice softer now, carrying something deeper than anything he had said so far. "I am trying to be here for it." And the simplicity of that statement settled into the space between them, not loud, not overwhelming, but present in a way that made it impossible to ignore, leaving Emily standing there, her hand resting on the rail, her eyes on him, caught between everything she had built alone and the quiet possibility that maybe, just maybe, She did not have to carry it all by herself anymore. Emily stood still after his words settled into the quiet room, her fingers lightly gripping the edge of the rail as if it were the only stable thing left, her thoughts no longer moving in straight lines but circling, returning again and again to the same realization she had been avoiding since he walked in. The steady beeping of the monitor continued, calm and indifferent, and she focused on it for a moment, letting the rhythm slow her breathing, because if she looked at him too long, if she let herself stay in that space between them, something inside her might shift in a way she was not ready for. "Being here is not enough," she said finally, her voice softer now, not sharp, not defensive, but honest in a way that felt more exposed than anything she had said before, and she did not look at him when she spoke, her gaze fixed on Lily as if the answer could be found there instead. Alexander did not respond right away, and that pause felt different now, not uncertain, not hesitant, but deliberate, as if he was weighing his words with more care than he ever had before, understanding that this was not a conversation he could navigate the way he did everything else in his life. "I know," he said quietly, and when Emily glanced at him again, there was something in his expression she had never seen before, something unguarded, something that did not belong to the man she remembered, and that unsettled her more than anger ever could. "Then what is?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper now, because the question had slipped out before she could stop it, pulled from a place she had kept hidden even from herself, and for a moment she regretted asking it, because it gave him space, it gave him a way in that she had not intended to offer. Alexander took a small breath, his gaze shifting briefly to Lily, before returning to Emily, and when he spoke again, his voice carried a quiet certainty that did not need to be loud to be felt. "Showing up," he said, "even when you are told not to." And Emily felt something tighten in her chest at the simplicity of it, because it was not a grand gesture, not a promise of fixing everything, just a presence that refused to disappear, and that made it harder to reject. She shook her head slightly, her lips pressing together as she tried to hold on to the boundaries she had set, because this was exactly how it started, not with force, not with pressure, but with small shifts that made everything feel less certain. "You did not show up before," she said, her voice firmer now, grounding herself in the truths she knew, the ones she had lived through, and she met his gaze again, this time without hesitation, because she needed him to understand that this was not something he could rewrite just by being here now. Alexander did not look away, did not deny it, and that alone made the moment heavier, because there was no argument to push against, no denial to reject. "You are right," he said, and the quiet acceptance in his voice made something inside her falter again, because it left her with nothing to fight except the past itself, and that was something she could not change no matter how hard she tried. The silence that followed was not empty, it was filled with everything they had not said for years, everything that had been left unresolved, and for a moment, Emily felt the weight of it pressing in from all sides, making it harder to breathe, harder to think clearly. She turned slightly, her hand moving to adjust the blanket again, the small motion grounding her, giving her something to focus on that did not require her to confront what was happening between them. "I made peace with that," she said quietly, her voice steady but softer now, and she glanced at Lily again, her expression shifting just slightly, something gentler, something more vulnerable. "I had to." And the truth of that hung in the air, simple and undeniable. Alexander watched her carefully, his posture still, his presence unchanged, but there was something in the way he looked at her now that felt different, not distant, not controlled, but present in a way that acknowledged what she had been through without trying to take it away. "You should not have had to," he said after a moment, his voice low, carrying a quiet weight that made Emily pause, her fingers stilling against the rail as she processed the words, because they were not about him, not about what he had done or not done, they were about her, about the burden she had carried alone, and something about that shifted the way she heard everything else he had said. She let out a small breath, her eyes closing briefly before she opened them again, and when she looked at him this time, there was something different in her gaze, not acceptance, not forgiveness, but something less rigid, less certain. "But I did," she replied, her voice softer now, almost tired, and for the first time since he had arrived, she did not sound like she was trying to push him away. She sounded like someone who had been holding something for too long and was not sure how to set it down. Alexander took a small step closer, not enough to close the distance completely, but enough to show that he was not leaving, not retreating, and when he spoke again, his words were simple, but they carried a quiet resolve that felt unshakable. "Then you do not have to anymore," he said, and the weight of that settled into the room, not as a demand, not as a promise she was required to accept, but as something offered without condition, leaving Emily standing there between what she had always known and something new she had never allowed herself to consider, her hand still resting on the rail, her eyes no longer avoiding his, caught in a moment where everything felt uncertain, but not entirely impossible. Emily did not answer him right away, and the silence that followed felt heavier than anything that had come before, not because there were no words left, but because the ones that remained mattered more than either of them was ready to admit. Her hand slowly loosened from the rail, her fingers resting lightly now instead of gripping, and she looked down at Lily again, at the small, steady rise and fall that had become the center of every decision she had made for years, every sacrifice, every late night, every quiet moment where she chose to keep going even when it felt impossible. The monitor continued its calm rhythm, unchanging, and she let herself listen to it for a few seconds longer, because it gave her something to hold on to while everything else felt uncertain. "You do not understand what that means," she said finally, her voice quiet, not sharp, not defensive, but carrying a depth that had not been there before, and she did not look at him when she spoke, because this was not something she could say while meeting his eyes, not yet. "It is not just about being here," she continued, her words slow, deliberate, as if she was choosing each one carefully. "It is about everything that comes with it, every day after this, every decision, every responsibility." And her voice softened slightly on the last word, not breaking, but bending under the weight of what it represented. Alexander listened without interruption, his posture still, his presence steady in a way that no longer felt intrusive. And when she finally looked at him again, there was no impatience in his expression, no expectation, only a quiet attentiveness that made it harder to dismiss what he had been offering. "I am not asking you to carry that alone," he said, his voice low, grounded, and the simplicity of it made something in Emily hesitate, because it was not framed as a solution, not presented as control, just an offer that existed without pressure. She shook her head slightly, her breath catching for a brief second before she steadied it again, because part of her wanted to believe that, wanted to accept that maybe things could be different, but another part, the part that had kept her standing all this time, resisted it with everything it had. "That is not how this works," she replied, her tone quieter now, less certain than before, and she glanced toward the window at the far side of the room, the faint outline of city lights visible through the glass, distant and blurred, like a world she had not been part of for a long time. "You cannot just step into something like this and decide to stay," she added, her voice barely above a whisper now, and the truth in her words was not meant to push him away, it was meant to protect both of them from something she believed could not last. Alexander did not argue, did not interrupt, and that alone made the moment feel different, because he was not trying to convince her, not trying to change her mind with words, he was simply standing there, allowing her to say everything she needed to say, and when he finally spoke again, his voice carried a quiet certainty that did not need to be raised to be heard. "I am not deciding anything for you," he said. "I am deciding for myself." And Emily felt something shift at that, small but undeniable, because it removed the pressure she had been expecting, the expectation she had been preparing to resist. She looked at him more carefully now, her gaze searching his face for something she could use to push back, something that would make this easier to reject, but what she found instead was something unfamiliar, something steady in a way that did not feel temporary. "And what happens when it gets hard?" she asked, her voice steadier now, more direct, because this was where everything always broke, this was where people left, where promises stopped meaning anything, and she needed to hear his answer, not the easy one, not the one meant to reassure, but the real one. Alexander did not hesitate this time, and that alone made her chest tighten slightly, because hesitation would have been easier to understand. "It already is," he said quietly, and the truth of that settled between them immediately, simple and undeniable, because there was nothing easy about this moment, nothing comfortable, nothing convenient, and yet he was still there. Emily felt her breath catch again, just slightly, because for the first time since he had arrived, she did not have a response ready, did not have a wall prepared to put up between them. Only the quiet realization that he was not speaking in hypotheticals, he was speaking about now, about what was already happening. She looked down again, her hand moving instinctively to rest closer to Lily, her fingers brushing lightly against the blanket as if grounding herself in the one thing that had never changed, and for a few seconds, the room fell into silence again, not tense, not strained, just full of something neither of them was rushing to break. When she finally spoke again, her voice was softer than before, almost hesitant, as if the words themselves were new to her. "You do not know how this ends," she said, and there was no accusation in it, no challenge, just a quiet truth that hung in the air between them. Alexander met her gaze without hesitation, his expression calm, steady, and when he answered, his voice carried a quiet weight that felt different from anything he had said before. "Neither do you," he replied, and the simplicity of it left no room for argument, no easy way to dismiss it, only the quiet possibility that for the first time in a long time, the future was not something she had to face entirely on her own, even if she was not ready to admit it yet. Emily stood there for a long moment after his words settled into the quiet room, the faint hum of the machines and the distant murmur of the hospital at night wrapping around them like a soft, unbroken thread, and for the first time since he had walked through that door, she did not feel the urge to push him out, not because everything had changed, but because something small inside her had shifted, something she could not quite name yet. Her gaze drifted back to Lily, to the gentle rise and fall that had anchored her through every difficult decision, every sleepless night, every moment she had chosen strength over fear, and she let out a slow breath, her shoulders easing just slightly as if the weight she had been carrying had adjusted, not gone, but no longer pressing in quite the same way. She moved closer to the bed without thinking, her fingers brushing lightly against the edge of the blanket, a familiar motion, steady and careful. And for a second she allowed herself to simply exist in that space, not deciding, not defending, just breathing. Behind her, Alexander did not move, did not speak, his presence steady but unobtrusive, as if he understood that this moment was not his to control, not his to rush, and that understanding alone felt different, felt real in a way she had not expected. Emily turned slowly, her eyes finding his again. And this time there was no sharpness in her gaze, no immediate resistance, just a quiet awareness that something had changed between them, something that could not be undone by a single decision or a single conversation. "I do not know what happens next," she said softly, her voice carrying a vulnerability she had kept hidden until now, and it was not a question, not a challenge, just the truth as it was, uncertain and open. Alexander nodded once, his expression calm, his eyes steady, and he did not step closer, did not reach for her, he simply remained where he was, allowing the space between them to exist without trying to close it. "Neither do I," he replied, his voice low, but there was no hesitation in it, no doubt about his presence, only the quiet certainty that he was not leaving. Emily looked at him for another second, searching, not for proof, not for promises, but for something simpler, something she could believe in without losing herself, and for the first time, she did not find a reason to turn away. Her hand shifted slightly on the rail, her fingers relaxing completely now, and she glanced back at Lily before returning her gaze to him, her breath steady, her posture no longer guarded in the same way. "Then do not make promises," she said quietly, and the words were not harsh, not rejecting, they were careful, intentional, a boundary that still existed but no longer felt like a wall. Alexander inclined his head slightly, accepting it without argument, without resistance, and that simple acceptance made something in her chest loosen further. Because it meant he was listening, not just hearing her words but understanding them. The room settled into a softer silence after that, not empty, not unresolved, but open in a way it had not been before, and for a few seconds neither of them spoke, because there was nothing urgent left to say, nothing that needed to be forced into the moment. Emily took a small step back from the bed, her movements slow, deliberate. And she stood beside it rather than holding onto it, her hands free now, no longer gripping, no longer anchoring herself in the same way, and she looked at Alexander again, not as someone she needed to push away, but as someone she had not yet decided to let stay. He met her gaze without stepping forward, his presence unchanged, steady, patient, and in that stillness, something quiet passed between them, not forgiveness, not resolution, but something closer to possibility. Emily exhaled slowly, her shoulders rising and falling with the breath, and she turned slightly, her eyes returning to Lily one more time, her expression softening in a way that held both strength and something new, something she had not allowed herself to feel before. Then, without looking back, immediately she spoke again, her voice calm, grounded, and softer than it had been at any point since he arrived. "You can stay," she said, and the words were simple, almost understated, but they carried more meaning than anything she had said before, because they were not given easily, not offered without thought, they were chosen. Alexander did not respond right away, and when she finally turned back toward him, she saw that he had not moved, that he was still exactly where he had been, his expression steady but quieter now, as if he understood the weight of what she had just allowed. He nodded once, not in victory, not in relief, but in acknowledgement, and that was enough. The monitor continued its steady rhythm, the soft light from the machines casting gentle shadows across the room, and outside the city moved on, unaware of the small shift that had taken place within these walls. Emily stood there, between what had been and what might still be, her hand no longer gripping, her breath no longer unsteady, and for the first time in a long time, she did not feel entirely alone, even if she was not ready to call it anything more than that. Sometimes, she realized, it was not about knowing how the story would end, it was about allowing it to continue, even when it felt uncertain, even when it did not follow the path you had planned, because in that uncertainty, there was still something worth holding on to. Something that could grow, quietly, patiently, into something neither of them had expected, but both of them were finally willing to face.